All right, thank you all for being here tonight as we start off on this year-long journey looking at American Catholic history. Before I get into the thick of it, there is more coffee on the way. There's more decaf and regular coffee brewing. So if you didn't get any before we started, or if you need a refresher while we're going along, feel free to get up, get more tea, water, whatever you might need. So, this whole project, this year-long project, began because of my own love for history. I was a history major in undergrad at John Carroll University, and even before that, I had always had a love for history, love for church history, love for the church, even before entering seminary. And so to have this opportunity of celebrating our nation's 250th anniversary, or I learned the fancy term, the semi-quincentennial. Say that 5 times fast. So as we look forward to celebrating that in July of this year, the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, really what we can point to as the beginning point of America. We can point to battles before that, the Constitution later afterwards, but really 1776, July 4th, the signing of the Declaration points us to the beginning of this great American experiment, as countless philosophers, countless political writers have described it over the years. And the Catholic Church, people of Catholic faith, have played no small part in this endeavor. And so as part of this national celebration, I wanted to be able to put on for us in at least some small way in this community, in this area, a look at how the Catholic Church has influenced the history of America. From even before its founding all the way to the present day, we see Catholics not only of political figures, not only in leadership roles, but also as the drivers of culture in many ways, drivers of many things that we take for granted in our own day. The Catholic Church and people of the Catholic faith have always been there since the very beginning of America and continue to play an important part. So as we begin tonight, as we begin this 12-month series, I hope that this isn't the first, that this may be the first, but it's not the last for you to join us, and that you bring others along the way as well. This is being recorded, and it'll be available online afterwards before the weekend hits, so that you can share it with family and friends. It'll be available on the parish's YouTube channel. But in order to begin, I wanted to look at, or first begin in prayer. Our first bishop in the United States, Bishop John Carroll, who in the foundation of America, when George Washington was elected president, he wrote a long prayer that was asking God to bless this nation, bless the people, and bless the groups that make it up. And so as we go along, we'll be taking snippets from his prayer, as well as some other prayers of famous American Catholics along the way. But let's begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We pray, O Almighty and eternal God, who through Jesus Christ has revealed thy glory to all nations, to preserve the works of your mercy, that your church, being spread through the whole world, may continue with unchanging faith in the confession of your name. We pray, O God of might, wisdom, and justice, through whom authority is rightly administered, laws are enacted, and judgment decreed. Assist with your Holy Spirit of counsel and fortitude the President of these United States, that his administration may be conducted in righteousness and be eminently useful to your people over whom he presides, by encouraging due respect for virtue and religion, by a faithful execution of the laws in justice and mercy, and by restraining vice and immorality. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So as we begin to look at our American Catholic history, before getting into the topic of tonight, which is covering kind of the early and pre-colonial periods, I wanted to first examine a little bit, as a history nerd and as a Catholic history nerd, something even more niche. the history of American Catholic history. Don't worry, this is not a major part of tonight's talk. But I really want to look at, what made all of this going on. And so we can start with who is often called the father of American church history, John Gilmary Shea. He wrote in the end of the 19th century, end of the 1800s, writing a 4-volume history of Catholics in the United States. 4 volumes, only about 100 years after the nation was born, only 400 years, not even, after the founding of the New World by Christopher Columbus. Already he was writing this tremendous work that historians have built on over the centuries. But other Catholic historians include J. Dolan, Father John O'Malley, a Jesuit of Boston College who recently passed away in the last few years. And another great of American Catholic history is John Tracy Ellis. He's kind of thought of as, after John Shea, this great figure in writing the great knowledge and great depth that we have of American Catholic history. And he has some great quotes that we'll return to over the night. And if you're interested in finding more about these topics, I wanted to bring just a snippet of my library. Just a couple books that I've been using in preparing for tonight at least, and for other nights coming up. And there are hundreds and hundreds of books dealing with American Catholic history, from niche histories about certain dioceses and places, even parish histories, all the way up to multi-volume histories of the United States like John Shea had written in the 1800s. All of this points to the great depth and great maturity of American Catholic history that, even as we'll discuss in these 12 months, we can only scratch the surface on. Because just like the history of the church at large, you can talk about one group or another, working in one area over another, how people have worked in social justice, in ministries, in missionary work, in founding churches, all these things that add up to American Catholic history that you can barely scratch the surface on. So if you're a history nerd or history buff, you can check out the American Catholic Historical Association. You can read J. Dolan's American Catholic Experience, Making of American Catholicism, American Catholics, A History, the American Catholic History Podcast. There's all different resources that you could look at and examine all the more to feed your hunger on this. I'm not going to say that I'm an expert in this field. This is something that I love to do, something that I love to read about still. And as I said, I'm only able to scratch the surface in what we can talk about, what we can examine in these 12 short months. So I want to begin by looking at a little bit of a timeline of what is going on in the New World and what is going on in the midst of the Catholic Church in the United States at this time. And this really helps set the scene of many things that we're going to talk about tonight. So as we all know from grade school, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He arrives in the New World. Christopher Columbus, of course, being Catholic, there was nothing else at the time. And while he didn't bring Catholic priests with him on his first voyage in 1492, in his subsequent voyages, he brought Catholic priests not only to minister to himself and his crew, but to act as missionaries spreading the gospel to the Native Americans, to the native peoples that he encountered throughout the Caribbean and the New World. And only 70 short years afterwards, we have the first Spanish Catholic settlement in what is today Florida. The Spanish had been exploring the Florida coast and the Florida Peninsula and all around other parts of the United States. But here we can really look at where the Catholic founding of America really begins. So we'll talk a little bit about what the Catholic Church in Florida looked like. And not too long afterwards, Jamestown is founded in 1607, struggling to get by for many, many years, but often looked upon as the beginning of the English colonies. Plymouth coming later, but Plymouth being much more successful in being able to be a true colony and spreader of people in the New World. But only 4 years later, French missionaries are arriving in Acadia, in the French-speaking part of what is today Canada and the United States in Maine. And they're making settlements, they're spreading the gospel, they're acting as fur traders and other traders with Native Americans, and the French are working to spread the gospel there as well. 1620, we have the arrival of the Pilgrims on the Mayflower at Plymouth, and there many people point to the very beginning of the American experiment, as the people of Jamestown came for economic reasons, to maybe escape prison or to try to find gold, try to find riches in the New World. The people of Plymouth, the Pilgrims, were coming for freedoms, for religious freedoms, for freedom of speech, freedom to be able to live their lives as they thought God wanted them to. And in many ways, that still ennobles what we consider the American experiment today. But not long afterwards, in 1634, you have the establishment of the Maryland colony, the truly first Catholic settlement, and it is established primarily as a Catholic colony. And we'll talk a little bit about how, that really didn't last all that long, unfortunately. So 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. Often Columbus gets a bad rap from not only Catholics, but other historians and other people of our time. People like to point to Columbus as the beginner of the slave trade in the New World and all these atrocities. But there's another side of Christopher Columbus. We can talk ad nauseum about, how true or what the depth of those claims really are. But we can see from just after his very first voyage, on returning to Spain, he first writes a letter that's to be sent to the King and Queen of Spain, who sponsored his voyage, who sponsored his expedition to what he thought was going to be India, what he thought was going to be establishing new trade routes. But what he came to realize was not India, was a new world with new peoples of strange cultures and strange ideas that they would have to grapple with. And one of the things that Columbus did was he noticed and wrote to the King and Queen of Spain of how these people, in his eyes, were open and available to the gospel. That was one of the things that he closes his letter with. Quotes from his letter to the Spanish royalty. He says, "They, the people that he encounters in Hispaniola, they have not religion or idolatry, except that they all believe power and goodness to be in heaven." He recognizes that first and foremost, while they don't have, idols or pagan worship that we might think of as the Romans or the Greeks or other cultures did, he recognizes already that they have this understanding of the grandeur of the heavens, this idea that it's not simply us, but there's a great power that is controlling and ruling over the world. And he sees that as the first spark, the first doorway into spreading the gospel to them. And he goes on to say, "In all the islands I observed little difference in the appearance of the people or in their habits and language, except that they understand each other, which is remarkable. Therefore I hope that their highnesses, the Spanish king and queen, will decide upon the conversion of these people to our holy faith, to which they seem much inclined." Already he had this sense that, these people aren't savages. They aren't less than human. If they were less than human, he wouldn't have wanted to spread the faith to them. If he thought that they were savages and incapable of knowing and understanding anything, he wouldn't have invited the king and queen to send missionaries, to send priests, to spread the Catholic faith to them. And so, we can talk back and forth about the ups and the downs of Christopher Columbus, but we can at least see from this foundation of the New World, this discovery of the New World, that already there was this seed of the Catholic faith that was desiring to be planted, that Christopher Columbus already saw in his heart and hopefully saw in the desires of God, to spread the gospel, to spread the faith even to these people that many would come to exploit, that many would come to see in other ways. And it's precisely for that reason that 45 years later only, Pope Paul III decided to issue this decree, Sublimus Deus, under God, and he says, he's talking about the great missionary work that the church has with these people, and precisely that they're people, because already in the 40 years that people were going to the New World, that explorers were going, they were already seeing in Europe that these people were being exploited, these people were being enslaved, these people were being maltreated. And Pope Paul III recognized that we need to put this to a stop, that we need to end this. And he says, "We who, though unworthy," talking about himself as in the role of the Pope, "exercise on earth the power of our Lord, consider, however, that the Indians are truly men, and that they are not only capable of understanding the Catholic faith, but according to our information, they very much desire to receive it." Already in those 40 years, there were countless missionaries that were going off to the New World, going off to Mexico, to modern-day Mexico and the southwest United States, down through South America, already showing that these people were converting in mass, not by force, not by gunpoint, but because the priests were able to connect so well with the people. That's not to say that they did it perfectly. Paul III even recognizes that there's mistreatment going on in the midst of the colonies. But if we're to spread the Catholic faith to them, if this new world is to be a new place of evangelization, it can't be by gunpoint, it can't be by war and by violence, because these people are truly people created in the image and likeness of God. So that's already setting the scene for us in how we examine Catholic history, because I think many people, we want to skip over this part and we want to go straight to, Maryland and the English colonies, precisely because there's some messy parts of our history, precisely because, yes, there were explorers, there were settlers, there were even some priests who didn't always do what they should have, who maybe enacted lots of violence, lots of hatred that really we see from the upper echelons of the church. They were trying to put to an end, they were trying to stop. But this already is the beginning of our Catholic faith in the United States, Catholic faith in the New World. So as we look at, we can examine three particular sources of Catholicism as in the New World. And we've already touched really on all three of them. And it's precisely the Spanish, the French, and the British, particularly the Spanish and the French, two Catholic nations with Catholic monarchies, with Catholic rulers and cardinals and bishops who had great power in their kingdoms, going hand in hand between conquest and settlement and colonization, with spreading the faith not only to Native Americans, but making sure that churches were established for them and for new colonies, that the faith was not going to die there, but the faith was going to thrive. Then we see later on the English, through the persecuted English Catholics, coming like the Pilgrims to find a place of freedom, a place of justice, a place of religious tolerance, and that still to this day is a difficulty for many. So if we look at the missionary work, the early missionary work in really the first 2 centuries of colonization in the United States, The Spanish really found their home base in the Caribbean and in modern-day Mexico, where they conquered the Aztecs, as we might remember from high school history, and then they spread their missionary work north and south from there. And the French, as they entered through the St. Lawrence Seaway, settled around the Great Lakes largely, spreading their missionary zeal to Native Americans largely in the Northeast United States, going down the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, all around the Great Lakes as the French colonizers also spread. But of course, we can't forget the English, and the English will pop up a little bit later on in the Maryland colonies, as I've been speaking about. So to go in any kind of sequential order, talking about these three great powers, it's certainly the Spanish that we need to start with. It was under the Spanish flag that Columbus was sailing to the New World, that Columbus was having these expeditions. And I think that we could easily categorize the most popular way that the Spanish were spreading their empire, spreading their kingdom, and also in many ways spreading the faith was through their conquests. It's the Spanish, explorers and conquistadors of Mexico, of Central America, of Peru and the Inca and the Aztec and all these ancient peoples. It was all the Spanish that were doing many of these conquests around the large, great empires of the Native Americans at the time. And as the Spanish went along in their conquests, as the soldiers went through to conquer new land, often in search of gold, in search of gems, in search of spices or anything valuable they could send back to the old world, Spanish priests were not far behind, or even among their ranks, already setting up missions, setting up places of encounter between the Native Americans and the native Spanish. And it's really in these missions that we see the overlap of these two cultures, these two cultures beginning to mix and interact in more than just a top-down, more than just a conquest and conquered relationship. But as priests learned the language of the natives, as they taught them Spanish, and as they tried to show them the beauty of the Catholic faith, and in many ways they converted easily, and in other places we can point to some forced conversions, some places where they were essentially told, you're either going to convert and live on the missions, or we're going to push you off your land, we're going to put you into the desert, we're going to essentially destroy your whole life. So there was some of that as well that we have to recognize. But if we're also to look at this in a particularly American, particularly United States perspective, one of the earliest dioceses established in the New World is the Diocese of San Juan, Puerto Rico, established in 1511, over 500 years old. Already there's bishops and priests and the church hierarchy taking its place among the missionary work of the peoples. And their Bishop Alonso Manso, worked zealously. He made travels not only around the island of Puerto Rico and the Caribbean islands, but to the Mexican mainland, to the Florida peninsula, all around where the Spanish were trying to go, where the Spanish were trying to settle. He would go and visit different settlements. And if, there's lots of different testaments, lots of different writings and letters that are being written back and forth between the missionaries and the priests in the New World and their bishops, their religious superiors back in Europe. And one of these was Father Alonso Benavides, and he was writing largely talking about the great work that they were able to do, the work that they were able to do among the natives, and he describes his missionary work in New Mexico. And these letters are describing not only the work they're doing in the faith, but it's describing countless natural wonders that we come to know in the United States. So he's speaking about his time in New Mexico, in the New Mexico missions as he says, in 1634, so a little bit later on, nearly a century after the founding of Puerto Rico, of the diocese in Puerto Rico. But he talks about how the natives are devoted to the service of the church. They live with him in the convent, and he and the rest of his priests with him take turns with the natives in doing work around the mission. That it wasn't simply the priests were, the superiors and they were telling the natives what to do, but they were living in a community. And this isn't the only perspective that is shared on in these Spanish missions, but it certainly speaks to some of the brighter sides of these Catholic works. And he says that they set up schools, they hear confessions, they do prayers day in and day out, and they collect food, clothing, money for the poor, so that it's not just simply caring for themselves. They're not working with the Spanish conquistadors and trying to gain wealth for themselves, but they're truly setting up what the church has always done: work and care for the poor, work and care for the lowliest. Even among themselves, among the natives, they're doing this great work that's setting the foundation for so many other things. One of the interesting stories is of Fray Juan de Padilla. He was a Franciscan, and like Father Alonso, he was traveling throughout New Mexico, traveling throughout the Southwest and the central United States, what would become the United States. And he's often considered the first martyr, the proto-martyr of the Catholics in the New World. He's not a saint, he's not a blessed, his cause really hasn't gone anywhere, but he was a Franciscan priest who, along with others, were going around that area of the United States. They had heard of other peoples in the plains, they had heard of other peoples around that they wanted to go and spread the gospel to. So besides being one of the first Europeans to see the Grand Canyon, he traveled to what is around present-day Kansas, where he tried to spread the faith, where he tried through interpreters to share the gospel, but he was ultimately martyred. He was ultimately killed for the faith, and his body taken back to the Spanish missions, where it has largely been forgotten, where it has largely gone missing. But his memory still lives on, and people have written about him over the centuries, calling to mind the great work and the devotedness of these Spanish and French priests in giving their lives to the Catholic faith. But all this is kind of tangentially talking about the church in the United States. We're talking about kind of missionaries that are going out to places, and then they don't last very long, so they move back to Mexico, move back to where the Spanish have their strongholds. They're not able to make these large footholds in what would be present-day United States, except where the Spanish begin to explore and settle in Florida. We might be familiar with the story of Ponce de Leon as he searches for the fountain of youth, searches for cities of gold throughout the Florida coast and the Caribbean. And he's one of the first explorers to go to the Florida Peninsula, and he brings with him priests, priests that go along with him, knowing that there's people there, knowing that there's, the faith can be spread among them. And one of these early priests that went to Florida was a friar or a priest by the name of Juan Juarez. He was named the Bishop of Florida, and really the bishop of what would be the whole United States, or at least the whole southern United States where the Spanish were exploring and trying to settle. And he is supposed to have had Mass on the Florida coast at some point, probably the first recorded Mass said in the New World. but he isn't able to stay there long, and while he's traveling to Mexico to be ordained a bishop, he falls sick and he dies. So while we might consider him the first bishop, he was never a bishop. His explorations and his missionary work is very limited from what we know. But we do know that not long after, 40 years later, Father Francisco López de Mendoza Grajales settles with the Spanish settlers in St. Augustine, which is still there today, one of the oldest cities in the United States. And in 1565, we have the recording of him having Mass for the soldiers, for the settlers, for this community of St. Augustine around the celebration of Easter. That's often why, that's where the root of Florida comes from. Florida having relation with flowers, and, Pascua de Florida, the Easter of flowers, or the Easter flower, that's where Florida comes from. And so Father Francisco is, we have definitive proof that he had Mass there around Easter in 1565, and there St. Augustine is able to begin to flourish. It really becomes the first foothold of the Spanish in what we would consider the United States. And there they spread up the Atlantic coast into Georgia, they spread westward into Louisiana, and of course they'll spread later into California and the rest of the Southwest, making more and more foothold as they go along. And this Spanish influence, continues to be felt today, continued to be felt, as the colonial period developed. Maybe one of the most famous missionaries of the Spanish area is St. Junipero Serra, who founded missions all along California, Los Angeles, the Angels, San Francisco, St. Francis, all these cities that were begun as Catholic missions by St. Junipero Serra in the latter part of the 1700s. Again, even later on, almost 200, close to 300 years after Columbus arrives in the New World, the faith is making its way to the Pacific coast of the United States. And he founds these Catholic missions, he founds these strongholds of Spanish influence and Catholic faith that continue to spread the gospel to the natives, continue to be a foothold for the Spanish influence. And in 1795, again after the founding of the United States, but still integral to what would later become the United States, the Diocese of what's called the Two Floridas and Louisiana is established, with its headquarters, with its seat being in New Orleans, but started under the Spanish when the Spanish were in control. And really there we have the second bishop, the first bishop in 1790 being John Carroll in Baltimore, but there we have the second bishop in the United States, or in the present United States, Bishop Luis. And Bishop Luis continued to spread the gospel, continued to go on missionary work himself up along the Mississippi River, along the Gulf of Mexico, continuing to spread the gospel, continuing to share the faith. So that Spanish influence, we continue to see it to our very day. Of course, the Spanish Catholics in the southern United States and the Southwest, even here in Cleveland and in many areas of the Midwest, continues to grow. The faith that started in these Spanish colonies and these Spanish countries continues to spread here in the United States through people of Puerto Rican, of Mexican, of Salvadoran descent, and even people coming as immigrants. So we still feel in our own day this influence of the Spanish Catholic foundation. But we can move on to the third part, to the second part of this Catholic trifecta, and it's really the French operating really in our own area, among the Great Lakes and the waterways of the Northeast. We see the French missionaries and the French settlements springing up and being strongholds in their own right. And as we look at these French settlements, really Quebec in Canada becomes the main stronghold of the French. While the Spanish had Mexico and Mexico City and spreading far south, the French were a little bit later to the game. They were trying to have colonies in other places, colonies in places that the Spanish were fighting over, but they eventually found that settling in the north was better for them, and they were able to find great strongholds there. And much like the Spanish, they used Franciscan and Jesuit missionaries mostly. Franciscans, this year Pope Leo has declared to be a Jubilee year of St. Francis because it's the 800th anniversary of the Franciscans. And so, the Franciscans have a long history in the United States as well as the Jesuits, not just with Bishop John Carroll, not just with St. Ignatius High School here and in other places, but the Jesuits were often called the Black Robes, were some of the most powerful missionaries that the church had in the New World. And they began to come about in the New World, in the French settlements at least, in 1604. It took 70 years later for the Diocese of Quebec to be founded. So it took the French a little bit later in the game to get going. But it's interesting to take a second to examine what the difference was between the French and the Spanish philosophies of settlement. The Spanish we know very well. It was the conquistadors, it was these great conquerors setting up these missions. They spread the net far and wide. If you were to look at a map of the Spanish Empire in the 1600s, it would go all the way from the northern California coast all the way down the Pacific to the tip of South America, taking up much of South America, all of Central America, most of the Caribbean, these places that the French or the Spanish were far and wide. But the French, on the other hand, were really exploring a lot of just the northeast United States, eastern and central Canada. They were a little bit slower. They weren't necessarily out to get all of the gold, or they weren't looking for the gold at least in the same places as the Spanish. I don't think any of them really found gold, but so fools on them. But the French and the Spanish, so the Spanish were trying to spread the faith often, by conquering lands, by conquering peoples, and then the priests would come in to minister to them to try to convert them. The French, on the other hand, would set up, a few strongholds like Quebec and later Detroit, and in other places they would set up these strongholds and these cities, and then the missionary priests would go out from there, and they would often, travel in small groups, travel by canoe, by hiking through the waterways, through the lands of the Northeast and the Great Lakes, and interacting one-on-one with the Native Americans in their own villages, oftentimes learning as many Native American languages as they could, or at least finding Native interpreters who knew French and could act as interpreters along the way. So the French really had what I would define as a much softer approach than the Spanish. Of course, there were atrocities that the French, had as well. But the French were really defined by three things: trade, number one, politics, and religion. These were kind of the three strongholds of what the French missionary and the French settlements were about. They were not mainly looking to conquer peoples, but they were looking to trade. Set up fur trades, set up fish trades, set up these trading systems that then they could send stuff back to France, they could make money in the New World, that they could kind of have more or less of a coexistence with the natives, not always working out. They often tried to set up treaties and agreements with native peoples, often with the Hurons or the Algonquins, and trying and failing with the Iroquois. Different native peoples, they would set up these treaties, they would try to have these kind of political alliances so that everyone, so that they would be able to send missionaries, they'd be able to trade, they'd be able to make money without, because they saw what the Spanish were doing. It cost the Spanish, countless, amounts of money, cost the Spanish countless soldiers to keep up these big missions. And so the French saw it was much more economical, much more to their advantage to approach the faith, to approach the new world in this way. And I think it really led to, in many ways, a deeper Native American conversion than what is often portrayed in the Spanish colonies, the most famous of which being St. Kateri Tekakwitha. But these alliances and this missionary work that they had with the Native Americans allowed them to set up these treaties, allowed them to have these relationships that they would eventually use in wartime going on. They would use to fight against the British later on in the American colonies. But it allowed the French missionaries to go into deeper territory without the need for soldiers, without the needs for guns and violence, which worked to their advantage sometimes and not so much for others. So as I said, they often set up alliances with the Huron, the Algonquin, other native peoples, and St. Kateri Tekakwitha, who died around 1680, is really, she's called the Lily of the Mohawks, one of these great saints that the French and we as Americans continue to hold up, being converted to the Catholic faith, being raised semi in the Catholic faith through one of her Catholic parents, and being able to witness to the great truth of the faith to other native peoples. That as she went to live in these Catholic settlements that the French set up for natives, so that the natives weren't being persecuted by their own people when they converted, she was able to live such a devout life, a life that continues to be inspiration for many. And like the Spanish, the French influence continues to be felt, and it in many ways is a much more tragic influence, or leads to a lot more martyrdom among the native peoples than the Spanish did. But one of the interesting writings is from John de Brebeuf, and that might be a familiar name among those who went to St. Ignatius or other Jesuit education. But he writes as a quasi-superior of the Jesuit community and the Jesuit missionary work in Canada. He's writing back to young seminarians, young Jesuits back in the New World that are preparing themselves to come to be missionaries, many of them even preparing themselves to die to spread the faith, knowing that others have died as well. And he uses such beautiful words to describe, maybe not great words to describe the natives, but at least in how they're trying to go about spreading the faith among them. He says, this is in 1637. He says, "The fathers and brethren whom God shall call to the holy mission of the Hurons," so speaking about the Jesuit priests and brothers called to be missionaries, "they ought to exercise careful foresight in all the hardships, annoyances, and perils that must be encountered in making this journey, in order to be prepared for all emergencies that may arise. You must have sincere affection for the savages," maybe not the best term, "looking upon them as ransomed by the blood of the Son of God, and as our brethren with whom we are to pass the rest of our lives. Looking upon them as ransomed by the blood of the Son of God, and as our brethren with whom we are to pass the rest of our lives." Even though he calls them savages, which we can chalk up to, how the French often referred to the natives at the time, it speaks so beautifully to what he's encouraging to the missionaries. It's not simply a job to do. It's not simply, a heroic thing that I'm going to go out and hopefully be martyred, or this is going to be an easy life. but he already is trying to show them this great compassion that is needed to spread the faith. And it's really this compassion that, he and other Jesuits were known for in trying to spread the gospel. They didn't go in with sword and gun, but they often just went in with their prayer books and their crosses, trying to be peaceful missionaries of the gospel, trying to look at these people as truly being made in the image and likeness of God, seeing them as being ransomed in the blood of Christ, as he says, as being worthy of accepting the gospel. And, this missionary work was also partnered with great explorations. You had Father Marquette, who, besides being a great priest and missionary, was known for exploring vast reaches of the Great Lakes, and especially Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota through the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. You had Friar Louis Hennepin, who was a priest among the expedition that were the first Europeans to see the Niagara Falls. And it's from his account, from his writings, that we have the first, description of Niagara Falls, talking about its great might and awe and wonder. Another priest, Friar Constantine del Hall, was with the first founders of the city of Detroit. Again, another strong French city and stronghold for missionary work. So these priests were not simply, going out into the wilderness, but they were also going with the great explorers, great workers of the French settlements. And, especially among in the Northeast, we still continue to feel French influence. Not so much anymore, we might say, in Michigan or in Wisconsin, to some extent, and in Minnesota. But it's, in these places that there is still a French heritage and a love for the faith that has been passed down through these missionaries. And of course, it's from the French missionaries, from the French Jesuits, that we have the North American martyrs, St. Isaac Jogues and his other Jesuit companions, who were martyred brutally by some of the natives in trying to spread the gospel. And they continue to be a great inspiration. These saints that people still to this day continue to look to. People make pilgrimage to their shrine in New York, and they continue to influence the Catholic Church today. But I think really what we have maybe been really looking forward to, or what we have in our mind when we're thinking about the foundations and the history of America, is precisely the British colonies, the 13 colonies that would become the very foundation, the beginning of the United States. And there too, of course, there's a Catholic beginning. There's a Catholic foundation. And, as the Catholics first arrived in Maryland we have the Mayflower for the Pilgrims, you have the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria for Christopher Columbus. But the ship that the Catholics came on to settle the colony of Maryland was called the Dove. The dove, of course, being a symbol of the Holy Spirit, and they saw it as the work of the Holy Spirit to establish this Catholic colony for freedom, for peace, for justice. So this Catholic colony, it's really interesting, because if we step back to maybe our high school history classes, or step back to what we know of English history, of course, this is after Henry VIII has separated himself and the country of England from the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England. And this is then, decades later and centuries later, as there's still squabbles between the Catholics and the Anglicans. And, there's times where there's Catholics in the monarchy. There's times when different monarchs are, not necessarily opposed to the Catholic Church and Catholics in England. And then there's other times when there's deep and bloody persecutions of Catholics in England. But in one of these times of more or less peace for the Catholics, King Charles I gives to George Calvert, who's the first Lord Baltimore, That's where the city of Baltimore is named. But he's First Lord Baltimore in England. This is before Baltimore is founded in Maryland. But he gives to George Calvert this right to establish his own colony, his right to establish it as he wills. And he decides to establish it as a Catholic colony because he himself is really an underground Catholic. And King Charles did this because, he must have known that Calvert was a Catholic because he was his Secretary of State. He was, one of the most high up positions that especially a lesser lord like himself could have had at the time. And so he's high up in the British government, and after retiring from Secretary of State for King Charles, he gives to him this ability to establish the colony in the New World. And so the first colonists are sent off by his son, Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, after George had passed. And he sends them off with instructions to establish, the Maryland colony, to establish this place with great peace, with great gentleness, with even religious freedom as well. And so when he sends them off, he sends them with a document that he wants them to remember and hold on to as they are going and establishing their colony. So as they're being sent off in 1633, he says to them, his Lord requires that in their voyage to Maryland, they be very careful to preserve unity and peace among all the passengers on board, and that they suffer no scandal or offense to be given to any of the Protestants. It's not all Catholics going over. Whereby any just complaint may hereafter be made by them in Virginia or in England. He's already trying to show the Catholics, what Christ continues to teach us in the gospel, to turn the other cheek, that, now that they have a colony of their own, don't then persecute the Protestants. Don't, push them out. Don't, force them into a lesser state in the colony, but to be at peace with them because, in reality, they hold the power. They're the ones that can go to Virginia next door. They can go back. They can write back to England, and this colony will be shut down before they know it. And so he really exhorts them to have peace, to really have this sense of recognizing that religious freedom is not just for them to freely practice Catholicism, but for there to be a freedom of religion in general among the settlers. And it's not long after, it's really within the same year, that the first Jesuits arrive in spring, and they have the first Mass there in the Maryland colony at St. Mary's in Maryland, and it's on the Feast of the Annunciation, so March 25th. They have this celebration of the first Mass for the colonists that really begins the English sense of American Catholicism, which I think many of us, that is what we identify with, or that is really what holds a lot of influence for us still today. And in setting up their government and having their colonial constitution, they spell out that they want mutual love and amity to prevail. That they're setting this up, and in many ways it mirrors and reflects the establishment of the Pennsylvania colony by William Penn and the Quakers, setting up a place of religious tolerance, which the Plymouth colony in some way had tried to do, except for Catholics. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But really this kind of great experiment of Catholic freedom, of freedom of religions in general, started in Maryland, and it's really this root in the Maryland colony and in the Pennsylvania colony next door that the American founders 150 years later are going to enshrine in our Constitution, enshrine in what it means to be America. But stepping back for a moment from the Maryland colony, there's an interesting historical question and historical gray area that we can look into. We can talk about Maryland as being the Catholic root of the British colonies, but there are some who argue that the Catholic presence in the British colonies started before that, started even with Miles Standish and the Plymouth colony. And as a reminder, Miles Standish was kind of the captain. He was the military advisor. He was the one with military know-how. He was experienced on the ships and captaining the ships and guiding the pilgrims in their journey across the ocean to the New World, and really being there to help set up a militia, to help set up defenses and stuff for the pilgrims. But himself, he was not a pilgrim. He was not of this Anabaptist, this, at the time, very extreme Protestant faith. But his family, the Standish family, had roots in both the Catholic and the Anglican churches in England. And, he himself had described, what part of the Standish family he came from. And he says that he comes from the same part that was largely Catholic. So that really is one of the things that points some scholars to thinking that he was Catholic. And one of the other things that's interesting is, the pilgrims kept, detailed records. They were some of the best record keepers of the colonial period. We have the list of names of the Mayflower Compact, who had what children died when, all these things. And they kept a tight roll on the names of the people enlisted in their church. But Miles Standish's name is never found there. It's presumed that he never joins the Pilgrim Church, even in Plymouth. And so there's some who say that because of the likelihood of his Catholic family background and the fact that he never joined the church even on paper, that he still remained faithful to his Catholic faith as much as he could in the solitude of Plymouth, being surrounded by non-Catholics. So it's an interesting reflection and point of interest that the Catholic faith really didn't only start with Maryland. That's where we can certainly point to. But Miles Standish, even in this great, golden foundation of the United States at Plymouth, we think of Thanksgiving, and we think of, even the first colonies and these roots that even the founding fathers, had this idea of Plymouth and this kind of mythology surrounding the Plymouth colony. That even there could have been a Catholic seed planted even there. And it's noteworthy, particularly because Massachusetts would become one of the great centers of anti-Catholicism in the colonies. The Pilgrims came to establish their colony of freedom of religion. Well, at least freedom for their religion. They were escaping from persecution from England, and unlike the instruction from Lord Baltimore to the Catholics in Maryland, they really weren't prepared to welcome with open arms other people or other faiths. Often when there were disagreements in their own Pilgrim church, they would banish them off and somebody would go and start their own colony. These divisions that were rampant among the people of Plymouth and other areas in the colonies. But Massachusetts, Virginia, New York, these large and influential colonies of the period were centers and hubs of anti-Catholicism. If you remember back, one of the great church historians I mentioned was John Tracy Ellis. And he says that anti-Catholicism is one of the most deeply rooted prejudices in America. He says even going back to Jamestown and Virginia and the Pilgrims, and one of the things that often brought disputing colonies together, in many ways, or in some small way, was their despise and their hatred towards the Catholics. They could say, well, at least we can agree on that thing, and it's put into law even. In 1642 and 1647, there's laws in Virginia against priests, against Catholics in general, and often describing these laws as anti-popery laws, or anything having to do with the Pope. They connected with the Catholics, understandably so. So it's interesting to look at these, especially the Massachusetts, how just deeply prejudiced it really is, and the amount of the hatred that is in there. So this is in Massachusetts anti-priest law of 1647. They speak against the secret practices of the Jesuitical order. This maniacal way of looking at the Catholics. They say that no Jesuit or ecclesiastical person ordained or with authority of the Pope shall henceforth come within our jurisdiction. And if any person shall give any cause of suspicion that he is of such society, that he's a priest, that he's a religious, he shall be brought before some of the magistrates, and if he cannot free himself of such suspicion, he shall be committed or bound by the court and proceed with banishment, or otherwise as the court shall see fit. And if the person so banished shall return a second time within this jurisdiction, he shall, upon lawful trial and conviction, be put to death. Provided this law shall not extend to any such Jesuit cast upon our shores by shipwreck or accident. So, they're at least a little merciful in saying, well, if the weather pushes you here, we'll give you some time. And the Virginia law says much the same thing, not going so far as to extend the death penalty, but again talking about banishment and saying, they have 5 days from their warning of being in the colony to leave. There was this great fear, this great hatred that they had. The Virginia law said that they were to pay 100 pounds of tobacco as the fee for being a Catholic, for being a priest in the Virginia colony. And you can think, Virginia and Maryland, especially the colonies at the time, were right next to each other. Especially the people of Jamestown were often going into Maryland and setting fire to people's barns or churches, causing havoc among the Catholics because of this hatred, because of this prejudice. And we can, again, look at a little bit of a timeline of this that shows just how quickly the dream of Catholic freedom in Maryland began to fall apart. Not just in Virginia. These laws weren't just in Virginia and Massachusetts and otherwhere, but they came to be in Maryland also. So again, between 1632 and 34, you have the decree from the king on the establishment of the Maryland colony. 1638 is the first report from the Jesuits in the colony talking about the growth of Catholicism and the beauty that it is to have their own colony, to have their own freedom, a place that they can, teach catechism, that they can pray openly, that they can do these things that Catholics in England had been doing, only a century before the persecutions. This freedom that they didn't have back in their home country. And then between 1642 and 47, as we saw, these anti-Catholic laws are beginning to pop up, and they spread throughout all the colonies. Pennsylvania being one of the only ones that doesn't enact anti-Catholic laws. In 1649, Maryland passes an actual act of toleration of religions, act of religious toleration, saying exactly what Lord Baltimore had set out for them to do, to be peaceful, to set up this freedom of religion not only for themselves, but for all others, so that they could live in peace, so that they could live in harmony, so that these wars and persecutions and killings and squabbles back and forth that they were experiencing in England wouldn't just continue on in the colonies. But that lasted 5 years, because in 1654 already, the anti-Catholics in Virginia and other neighboring colonies are already coming into Maryland to wreak havoc, to persecute the Catholics. And then during that time, during that time in the 1650s, there's an anti-Catholic law passed in Maryland. So this colony that had been established only 20 years earlier as the Catholic haven, as the Catholic colony, as the Catholic seat and heart for the colonies, is already in many ways squashed. The Protestants of Virginia take over the government, by force in Maryland, set up their own governor, set up their own magistrates, and pass these laws so that Catholics would be persecuted. Not to the same extent as maybe in Virginia or in Massachusetts with the death penalty, but for all intents and purposes, the Catholic faith goes underground in Maryland at that time. It's around this time that the great Carroll family, a influential family from the United Kingdom, is arriving in the United States, setting up their plantations, and there they set up their own private chapels that become in many ways centers of the Catholic faith and protected under their great wealth and protected under their influence. But really, the Catholic churches are essentially closed. There's no more public masses. The faith goes underground, and it's persecuted just exactly as it is in England. But there is a little bit of a bright spot that comes 30 years later in 1683, when laws of toleration are passed in New York. By this time, there's already general toleration in Pennsylvania, so many Catholics are going to Pennsylvania and to Philadelphia to find some freedom. They still can't precisely practice their faith out in the open, but they're at least not fearing for their lives, or not fearing that their houses or farms are going to be set on fire by anti-Catholics. And for a brief moment, even the state of New York, the colony of New York, has some religious toleration, as it's put under the government of an Irishman who enacts these laws to try to put an end to this anti-Catholic sentiment. But these laws are quickly repealed after he is no longer governor. But this isn't to say that until 1776, the Catholics in these British colonies were suffering and being persecuted constantly. In many ways, it was mostly priests that were fearful. It was mostly the priests and especially the Jesuits coming from France, coming from England or other parts of Europe, that had to disguise themselves, had to hide in people's barns, find places to hide in their houses from authorities, so that they could still minister to the Catholics that were there. As I mentioned, it's not so perfect in Maryland, and these persecutions arise at the same time that Oliver Cromwell is coming to power in England. This is the time of the overthrowing of the monarchy in England, and it goes into this kind of revolution and civil war where they set up a much more kind of Republican or democratic way of government. But Oliver Cromwell rules as a great dictator, really, almost as a king himself. And he himself is very anti-Catholic, so these anti-Catholic laws are being pushed by the English government, are being pushed onto the colonies in some ways, or at least reigniting the fire of anti-Catholicism that had been there for a while. And as I said, it's Thomas Dongan that is the governor of New York that enacts these laws of toleration that gives some freedom, gives some sense of normalcy for the Catholics, but it really doesn't go much further from that. And in 1704, we're inching closer and closer to the founding of America in 1776. We again have these laws and acts to prevent the spread of popery. Not potpourri, but popery. And it's in these laws that there's still, again, a great attack against the Catholics, and particularly against priests. So in 1704 is the law in New York, but in 1700 there's an act against Jesuits and popish priests in Massachusetts. And again, it's coming about that it says, all and every Jesuit, seminary priest, missionary, or other spiritual or ecclesiastical person made or ordained by any authority extending from the Pope or See of Rome, now residing in this province, shall therefore depart from and out of this province before the 10th day of September. And then it goes on to say that essentially people are given free rein to kill a priest if they find one. They're going to put them in prison. Essentially they're a walking dead man if they decide to stay in the colony. Again, 1700. You might be thinking that by then the colonies are starting to settle down. It's still before the French and Indian War by the British in the mid 1700s, but still even here they're talking about they're talking about these evictions, these death penalties, all these things that essentially they're saying we're going to wipe our hands of any of this, and we're just going to let the mob rule all of it. And so, part of this is tragic, of course. Part of this speaks to the deep-rooted anti-Catholicism in our nation, but it's not something that really lasts out in the public sphere too long. Of course, we might still point to anti-Catholic sentiment in the public sphere today. We can point to different things just in the past century, but at least after the founding of the United States, this type of rhetoric seems to settle down, at least by official laws. There's always going to be those splinter groups and small societies that try to attack the church. But there's a shining and bright light present in the colonies. Just as Maryland was kind of the first seedbed, the birthplace of the Catholic faith in the British colonies, it was really in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia particularly that the Catholic faith was able to stay alive in a public way. So in 1734, thanks to the general religious tolerance, especially even more so by that time in the Pennsylvania colony, the Jesuits, the priests are able to establish really a permanent church. And we could say that it's the first, it's one of the oldest continuous running churches in the United States. There's a church in Maryland that still holds the title of being the longest, serving Catholic church from the British colony, St. Francis Xavier. I think that was founded in around 1645 or so. But really, it even though it was still open during these persecutions in Maryland, it was really underground. So we see here in 1734, a mere 42 years before the foundation of the United States, that public masses are finally able to be said in Philadelphia. So they established this church of St. Joseph and later its sister church of St. Mary's. St. Joseph is the picture in the lower left, and St. Mary's is in the top right. And what's interesting, you can somewhat tell from the picture of St. Mary's, but St. Joseph is particularly interesting because even though they could have public masses, even though they were tolerated by and large, they still couldn't be open, we might say. There was no entrance to the church from the street. You know, there wasn't anything like we would see today, like stairs going down to the sidewalk to the main street. From the street, it looked like any other brick building around. But once people entered in through a little courtyard, then they were able to see the bell tower. Notice how the bell tower doesn't even go much, if at all, above the roof line. You know, it just barely gets to the top of the neighboring building. You know, and there the people were able to enter the church through a small side entrance, and that's still how it is at St. Joseph's today. And St. Mary's, too, you can see there's a large wall in front of it, and there's a barely visible entrance there. Because even though they were tolerated, it still wasn't fashionable, it still wasn't desirable by many people of the colonies. And so the Catholics recognized that, okay, if they're going to, ride the wave on this religious tolerance thing, they're going to need to be careful about it. They're still going to need to act in many ways like they're underground. They're still going to need to protect themselves and watch out for themselves. Hence why they built St. Joseph's as they did, kind of from the street looking like nothing else. But if you knew that which was the entrance to the courtyard, you could find your way into the church, and there you could celebrate your Catholic faith with other Catholics. Really the only public mass that was available throughout the colonies around that time. As we get closer to the Revolutionary War, closer and closer to the end of the colonial period and beginning of the nation, this tolerance begins to spread a little bit more. New York starts to become a little bit more tolerant, especially as New York City grows. Maryland regains its Catholicity, its sense of Catholicism, and all these, the underground church and the priests that have been in hiding are able to come out a little bit more. And so, that really brings us to the end of this, looking at the foundations of our Catholic faith in America. Starting from the Spanish colonies of Central America to the French missionaries in the Northeast, and then to the meat of the matter in the English colonies. We see that the Catholic faith has gone up and down just in these 2.5 centuries that we've covered tonight. And it will continue to grow, will continue to face difficulties as it moves along throughout the time. So as a little preview to next time, so a reminder, I look forward to seeing you again in February 25th, once we get into Lent. And there we're going to talk about our early nation, the Catholics and our early nation, to give you a little bit of a heads up on that. We're going to talk about, some of the most influential, not only Catholics, but founding fathers at the time who were either open to, having tolerance and freedom for Catholics, or were Catholic themselves, and the great influence and great work that they did in the Revolutionary War, in the early years of our nation, and really in getting our nation going as we get to the end of the 1700s. So thank you all for joining me tonight. Again, like I said, this lecture will be available on the parish's YouTube channel, and it will be shared on Facebook so that you can share it with others as well. And I hope to see you back in February and bring a friend along as well. Thank you.